So I have no idea what I'm doing with this channel anymore because my autistic brain won't let me focus on any one thing. Like every time I decide I'm going to start a new series or do a bunch of videos all at once, I do like 2 or 3 and then I just lose interest all of a sudden. So screw it, I'm just going to do whatever comes to mind. So today I decide I'm just going to talk about the worst king in French history. Pop quiz. How many kings of France were there? Time's up, pencils down. Doesn't matter what answer you gave, you're wrong. The reason I say that you're wrong is that it doesn't matter what number you gave because the answer isn't a number. The correct answer is, it depends on what you define as French. For example, you could start with the Bourbon dynasty, which starts in 1792. Or you could go back to the House of Capet in 987. Or you could go back to the Frankish kings in 843. Or you could go even further back to the kings that were Frankish, but not actually living in France. Luckily for everybody involved, you and me, we're not actually going through all of them, we're just talking about one of them. And I know what you're probably thinking, you already know who the worst one is. It's the last one, Louis XVI, you know, the one who lost his head. And you would be extremely wrong, because the list of French monarchs includes John I, who was a 5-day-old baby. It includes such luminaries as Louis V, who is also known as Louis the Do-Nothing. And it includes such great people as Charles III, also known as Charles the Fat. And all of the people I just mentioned are above in ranking to the person we're talking about today, Charles VI. So here's the thing. In fiction, there is a long-standing trope for thousands of years of the quote-unquote mad king. You see this all the time in depicting a king who is actually insane, who is overly cruel or violent. But amazingly, despite how prevalent the idea of the mad king is, there are actually very few kings who are genuinely mad. There are bad kings, there are kings that are not good at their job, there are selfish kings and greedy kings. Very few kings are actually insane. Like, if you were going to list off the top of your head all the mad kings that you could possibly come up with, most people would be like, Caligula, you know, the guy who made his horse a consul, or Nero, the guy who fiddled while Rome burned, or Peter III of Russia, who gave up all of his territorial gains in war to his idol in Prussia. Or maybe you would be like, okay, what about George III of Britain after he lost the American colonies during the American Revolutionary War, and he just starts wandering the halls of Buckingham Palace talking to nobody? Most people, I think, if you were trying to talk about mad kings, will generally err on the side of, oh, someone like, you know, Vlad Tepes, you know, a dude who is extremely cruel. But even then, it's hard to be like, oh, he's completely insane. Because insane monarchs don't tend to live very long. When you're completely insane, you either end up immediately sidelined by all the people who want to take advantage of you, or you end up dead because you've pissed off a whole bunch of people who now have no use for you. So in essence, you end up like King George III, where you are isolated from court and other people run the government for you, or you end up like Caligula or Peter III, and you're murdered by other people because you're causing lots of problems and a danger to them. What I'm getting at is that there aren't a lot of kings who are both insane and also live for a very long time, and Charles VI manages to do both. Now, I know what some people are already thinking, well, if he's insane, you can't really blame him for being a bad king because he's incapable of actually being a king. But as we'll get into, he was a bad king even when he was lucid. The other reason, as we'll also get into, is that the difference in France from when he took over the reins of power and when he leaves the reins of power are so dramatically different that it's impossible not to consider him one of the worst kings in French history. I consider him the worst. So, without further ado, let's just get into it. Charles VI is born in Paris to, obviously, Charles V, his father. He had 2 older brothers. Both of them died before he was born, so Charles is immediately put into the succession. He's the one who's next in line for the throne. Now, it's worth pointing out that child mortality at the time was around 50%, so it's kind of amazing that he survived even to adulthood. On top of that, your average life expectancy was like 30, so you really want to have kids early. So the fact that Charles VI was born after two of his older brothers had already died means that his father was relatively old, which is why he dies when Charles VI is 11, and so now Charles VI, age 11, is now King of France. Obviously, having an 11-year-old run the state is not optimal, and so all of Charles VI's uncles, all of the brothers of his father, begin to take over the reins of government, at least theoretically, until Charles is old enough to take the reins himself. Pop quiz number 2. When is a child no longer a child? No, that's not a sexual question. It's a question of when do you get the full responsibility of being an adult? When is the age when that happens? For example, in America, there are 3 answers you can give. It's 16, because that's when you can drive. That's also the age of consent in most places, as far as I'm aware. 18 is when you're quote-unquote legally an adult. You get an adult license. You're allowed to buy cigarettes. You can be 21, because that's when you're allowed to drink. One of those 3 is going to be your answer. All of those, by the way, are wrong for the period we're talking about. In the Middle Ages, the age of adulthood was 14, and the reason for that is because Catholic canonical law says that children become adults at 14, although I don't know if that's changed, but at the time, that's what was accurate. So theoretically speaking, Charles VI should have taken over the reins of power at age 14. Only Charles VI doesn't take power at 14. He doesn't take power at 15. He doesn't take power at 16. He doesn't actually take power until he's 21. As you can probably imagine, giving 4 people who aren't the king the power to essentially plunder the kingdom freely for 10 years does not leave your kingdom in a very good state. His uncles take advantage of the fact that they can basically raise taxes as they see fit and start, well, plundering the countryside. This results in many peasant revolts because the peasants are not exactly happy that they're being taxed so much. This, in turn, leads to the uncles using the royal treasury to raise troops to fight the people of France. In fact, they start making a habit of this because they start raising armies to fight each other as well as fight for more territories outside of France. So if you're living in France at this time, what you're seeing is there's like 4 dudes who are all relatives of the king who are taxing you in their own name, raising armies, and then fighting each other in France. This backstory is important because it's going to make a few things clear later as to why people are putting up with him. Because at age 21, when Charles VI actually takes over, the state of the kingdom is so bad that everyone pretty much assumes that he can't possibly be any worse than the status quo. And in fact, Charles VI seems to be relatively clear-eyed about the whole situation because he comes into power and immediately realizes that he can't trust anybody at his court because they're all related in some way to his uncles who are constantly scheming for things. So he essentially throws them all out and creates a new group of people, of minor lords and clergymen, who are going to act as his advisors. So you have 8 guys who are minor lords or clergymen. They're not civil servants of the state, and they're also not blood relatives. They're not major lords who actually have territory. Most of these guys are personal friends of Charles VI. What's amazing is the fact that normally when this happens, when the king is like, I'm going to put all my friends in charge, and we're going to run the state because we're all friends, when this happens, it usually leads to disaster. And you might also think that because the name they were all given were the marmosets. Now, for those of you who are aware, a marmoset is a monkey. And what makes it also kind of funny is that marmoset is what the French called the English at the time. So you're like, okay, the king has a bunch of his friends running the country, and they're colloquially known as a term that the French refer to the English, their hated rivals at the time. Surely these guys are terrible at their job, right? Somehow, some way, they're not. In fact, they're extremely good at their jobs. Amazingly, the policies that these guys put into place will later be reinstated by Charles VI's successor, Charles VII. Charles VII, by the way, is also known as the Victorious, so that should probably give you a general idea of how he's perceived and how well his policies worked out. In fact, Charles VI ruling through his marmosets goes so well that his people start to refer to him as Charles the Beloved. I'm saying a lot of good things, and you're probably wondering, wait a second, if the guy is referred to as the Beloved, and everybody loves him, and he's doing such a great job, how exactly is he the worst king of France? And now is where we get to that. Set the scene in your brain. The king has been a boy for 10 years. It's so bad because all of his uncles have been plundering the place. When he gets into power, he puts people who know what they're doing into positions where they can actually do things. The country seems to be running pretty well for a few years, and he starts getting known as the beloved. Now, how bad do you think his madness was that all of this goes to hell? So, amazingly enough, it all begins with an assassination attempt. Now, the assassination attempt isn't against Charles. It's actually against one of his friends. And though it doesn't succeed, Charles gets it in his head that he absolutely, at all costs, has to punish the one responsible. And the reason that this matters is because the assassin flees to Brittany, which at this point is under the control of the English. So essentially, despite the fact this is during the 100 Years' War, Charles is like, I need to mount an army and invade Brittany in order to punish a single assassin who didn't actually succeed in murdering my friend. So now it's war, and while this is a fairly common occurrence during the 100 Years' War, there's a problem because Charles doesn't appear to be all put together. Most of the guys around him notice that he's kind of off, as his madness, which is probably schizophrenia, starts to become more pronounced. So he alternates between demanding that everybody rush and move as fast as possible to questioning what everybody is doing, where he is, and who he is. He didn't appear to be entirely cognizant of what was going on, and then he would immediately switch over to demanding that everybody move extremely fast because they had to do it immediately. You can probably imagine that this is a big problem for an army, because Charles is still demanding that the army constantly hustle to go faster, but at the same time will then forget where they're going and what they're doing. And so the army is sort of disorganized and doesn't really know how to get where it needs to go or how to prosecute a war when your commander is, well, in the throes of schizophrenia. And here's where things get weird and sort of truth is stranger than fiction. So the army is marching through the forests on its way to Brittany to get an assassin that has failed to assassinate one of the king's friends. While they're traveling through the forest, a half-naked leper jumps out of the woods and runs up to the king and grabs his horse. The half-naked, crazed leper is screaming like doomsaying prophecies about how everything is going to be ruined, how he's been betrayed, how it's all going to be a disaster. And the guards, seeing that this crazy man jumped out of the woods and immediately accosted their king, beat the man, but don't arrest him. The guards, for whatever reason, just allow this dude to wander alongside the army. So as they're marching through the woods, there's a crazed half-naked leper screaming doomed prophecies at them. And that's not the weirdest part of this story. So they get out of the forest. At this point, they've been marching all day in full armor. The guys who are carrying the arms and armament of the king, because the king obviously is not going to wear all that stuff himself, are extremely tired. So tired that the dude who's carrying his lance passes out from heat stroke. Why is this important? Well, the dude who's carrying his lance and passes out from heat stroke drops the lance onto the guy carrying the king's helmet. This creates a very loud clanging sound. At which point, the king loses his mind, because he immediately thinks that they're under attack. He draws his sword, turns around, and charges his own men. Imagine the scene. You're moving through the forest, it's hot, you're tired, and then a dude up ahead passes out because he's so hot and tired, and drops the lance. The king hears a metal clanging sound, draws his sword, turns around, and charges you. The king starts killing people, and the solution to this problem was for everybody to mob him, drag him off his horse, and pin him to the ground. At which point, the king falls into a coma, despite the fact that he's not actually injured. And so now at this point, everybody kind of looks at themselves and goes, you know what? This campaign's probably not worth it. Let's go drag the king somewhere where he can't hurt anybody else or himself, and we'll just forget this ever happened. But the thing is, this is sort of the pattern of his entire life, because he would be lucid for months, even years at a time in some cases, and then he would just completely lose it and act in ways that no one could explain. Like, he would have moments where he would be able to manage his realm completely effectively, and then one day he would just forget who his wife and kids were. In one case, there's a situation where his wife comes in and he doesn't remember her, and so he's asking the servants, who is this woman and why is she bothering me? And the servants have to explain to him that he's the king and she's the queen, to which the king says, well, if I'm the king, then give her whatever she wants so that she'll stop bothering me. And things get even weirder from there. There's a moment where apparently he woke up one day and decided that he was St. George, patron saint of the English. Again, he's the king of France, and he's walking around talking to all of his knights saying, I'm St. George, patron saint of the English. And sometimes he would just run naked through the halls of his castle, howling like a wolf. In fact, his family and courtiers were so worried that he might escape and hurt himself or someone else that they bricked up all the entrances in his home. At one point during his reign, he just decided that he wasn't going to bathe or change his clothes for 5 months, and basically stunk up the whole joint. Now, obviously, as he got older, these breaks with reality grew ever more extreme, and they started lasting longer and longer. It got so bad that the Pope himself, at the time, Pope Pius II, actually wrote down about his condition. Apparently, there was a time when Charles decided that, for whatever reason, he was made of glass, and that if he touched anyone else, he would break. And so, in order to fix this problem, he basically instituted a kind of social distancing where no one was allowed to pass him in the halls or be anywhere near him. He also decided that a suit needed to be made where his clothes had iron rods sewed into them so that he would be protected even if he bumped into someone. So now you might be thinking, okay, the king is clearly mad, but he doesn't appear to be malicious or vicious, and it doesn't appear that anyone is being hurt because of his particular insanity. I mean, aside from those guys he murdered in a frenzy on his campaign. Yeah, those guys are dead. But aside from that, he doesn't seem to be, overly cruel the way someone like Caligula was. And that's pretty much the case for most of his rule. The problem is that nobody else around him seemed to have any common sense either. Because you would think, okay, we have a guy, he's clearly insane, he can't run the state for most of the time. We basically should just keep him far away from everybody else and hope that nothing goes wrong, right? That's what you would plan to do, right? Well, that apparently wasn't the plan of everybody else who was around him, despite the fact that they at one point bricked up all the entrances, as I said. Because you see, he's a noble, and so he still has to do noble things. And what do nobles do? They party. The solution that everyone came up with when they were like, how do we deal with the king, was, what if we just surround him with loud noises and drunken idiots all the time? Keep in mind, this is a party among medieval nobility, among an absolute monarchy. Okay? These are the upper crust of society. They have essentially unlimited wealth and access to anything they want. So if they want to have an exotic party, they can absolutely do so. And so what ends up happening is they essentially spend all of their time partying. There are raucous celebrations all the time. People are drinking constantly. There are exotic fashions being shown at court because they're trying to keep the king amused so that he doesn't do anything monumentally stupid or dangerous. It's so bad that it's basically like a Marie Antoinette situation where the monarchy is so extravagant and having all of these parties for a king who's not all together. And you might be like, okay, so later on in French history, this leads to the end of the monarchy. How does this go down among the peasantry? Because surely the peasants can't be happy that the monarch is spending all of their tax dollars partying it up constantly. And surprisingly enough, the peasants are actually in support of the king. They actually approve of what he's doing, because even with the insane parties, even with the fact that he's not altogether there, he's still a better king, and he gives them better rule than the king's uncles had. Because an insane king can't really run a state, and so he's not really capable of levying heavy taxes. He's not really capable of demanding that they all march off to war. And so, despite the fact that he's spending all of his time partying, for the most part, he's still a better king than the guys who were in charge of the state before him. And I don't think there's a better case of demonstrating how much the peasants sort of side with their own king when it comes to bad things happening than an event that happens during his reign known as the Ball of the Burning Men. Some quick backstory. Charles VI has a wife named Isabel. Isabel's primarily the one who came up with the idea that, well, we should surround the king with a bunch of parties and good times because, I mean, that's the best way to keep him entertained so that he doesn't do anything that'll hurt himself or others. And God bless her, because it probably was not very easy to be the queen of an insane monarch who forgot who you were half the time. So the event that's going on this time is a wedding. One of Isabel's ladies-in-waiting, who's a widow, is getting remarried for the third time. So here's the thing. Most people, when you think of a wedding, think of a somber, serious kind of religious affair, especially medieval weddings. So most people think of a medieval wedding. They either think of like the opulent weddings of like monarchy where everything is very, static and ritualized, or they think of like the very simple weddings between common people, where it's all focused on the religious aspect. That's usually what people imagine when they think of a wedding. Even today, most of the time, weddings are depicted as serious emotional affairs where two people come together. And that's all true, but that's not how the medieval people treated remarrying. Because you see, when somebody gets remarried because of being widowed for whatever reason, it's treated as a reason to party very hard. When I say they partied hard, I mean they partied really, really hard. Okay, imagine a content house party today. There are people all over the place getting way too drunk. There's really loud music being played all hours of the night. This goes on for days. There's loud feasting. People are swearing, getting naked in public. It's pandemonium, basically. So how does this party end up being referred to in history as the Ball of the Burning Men? And again, what ends up happening is another case of truth being stranger than fiction. So a guy named Hugh is credited with coming up with the idea. Basically, he comes to everybody and says, guys, I have a great idea for a party trick. It'll be amazing. The thing is, though, is that even at the time, this Hugh guy had a reputation for being cruel and coming up with really bad ideas. So it's not exactly clear why everyone went along with this idea, because as you'll see, it's really stupid. His idea is that a bunch of nobles and the king are going to dress up as wood savages. Now, what's a wood savage? In 1393, the term wood savage refers primarily to sort of a folkloric creature of crazy wild men who live in the forest naked and are sort of like wolfmen figures. Like, it's a sort of mythological, folkloric kind of idea in Europe where, like, people will leave civilization and live in the woods and become, like, naked, hairy guys. It's also sometimes referred to as being, like, wolfmen. And so Hugh's idea is that, okay, we're going to get a bunch of rich guys and we're all going to dress up like savages and we're going to make a fool of ourselves because it's a party and that's what we'll do. But remember, these aren't plebeians, okay? These are noblemen. These are rich guys. And so they can't just get naked and dance around. That's way too cheap. You need to make it as complicated and as expensive as possible. So what they did was they made linen suits, and then they coated the linen suits in resin, and then they covered the resin-covered linen suits with flax. And then once all that was done, they sewed up the guys in the suits. Some people are probably already imagining what the problem is. Because imagine you have linen, which is highly flammable, and then you coat it in resin, which is highly flammable, and then you attach flax to it, which is highly flammable. And the primary source of light in medieval Europe are torches. But we're not done yet, because you see, this wasn't enough. No, they needed to put masks on them that were also made of all this stuff, and then to top it all off, they wanted to chain them all together with manacles. Now, some people are already like, wait, how did nobody know this was a bad idea? And here's the amazing thing. They did know it was a bad idea. Everybody involved knows how flammable these suits are. So much so that they ban any torches from being lit in the entire castle while this is going on. Okay? all of the fire sources have to be doused so that no sparks occur, so that nobody catches on fire. They're fully aware how dangerous this is. Especially because, again, the king and several other major noblemen are doing this. So now you're probably going, okay, how does this go wrong? Because all of the precautions seem to have been taken. And again, it's so stupid that it's another case of truth being stranger than fiction. So the events go like this. The king and his guys all come in dressed as savage wild guys. They're howling at the moon. They're screaming obscenities at women. You know, they're making a fool of themselves, and everything's going really well. Cut to outside the castle. Outside the castle is the king's brother, Louis. Louis has been taking advantage of all the fun parties that are going on outside of the castle, because again, this is a party for the nobility. It's not just in the castle, it's in the surrounding area. Louis is about 6 hours into the partying at this point. He is heavily intoxicated. If he was bar hopping, he's at like bar 7, having drank an entire bottle of whiskey at every single bar he was at. Drunken idiot Louis is so heavily intoxicated that he's barely able to function. But he hears a huge disturbance or celebration going on inside the castle, and he becomes curious. So he grabs a few of his mates and he's like, steer me towards the door, I want to see what's going on. He's so drunk that he can't see anything, and so when he stumbles in to the area where these guys are, his first instinct is to hold a lit torch up to the face of the first person he sees, which again immediately sets them on fire. And because everybody is chained together, sparks start flying and other people start catching on fire, which is, you know, a problem. Now, there's two things amazing about this in hindsight. One is that the king didn't die and wasn't even injured. And the second thing is that the monks in attendance decided to record information about this event in lurid detail. And I do mean lurid details. According to the monks, 4 men were burned alive, their flaming genitals falling to the floor. I didn't need to know that. Maybe it's just because I'm used to, like, the modern day depiction of monks, where they're, like, chaste and innocent and stuff, and kept away from, like, all this weird or graphic stuff. But monks in the Middle Ages are extremely prone to writing just the most graphic, lurid things you can imagine. And I don't know if it's because they were close to death and dismemberment and just horror on a regular basis, because again, it's the Middle Ages, or what, but I censored most of the details I've already given you, and they go into way more detail, and it's actually kind of gross. So about now, you're probably thinking, wait a second, this wasn't the king's fault. The king didn't set anybody on fire. It wasn't the king's idea to do this stunt. And though he's insane, you know, can you really count this against him? The answer to that question is no, and in fact, the peasants would agree with you. In fact, the peasants are so angry about their king being put in danger like this, that people start to think there's going to be a revolt. At which point, everybody decides that what needs to happen is a walk of shame. You remember that scene in Game of Thrones where Cersei is walking through King's Landing? You know, during the walk of shame? That's what happens here. The king rides on his horse while everybody else is walking behind them in rags while the populace shouts obscenities and throws things at them. That's what happens. And you're probably like, okay, so wait a minute. The king's insane. He's known as Charles the Mad. He's known as being the worst king, and yet the peasants adore him. How do you square these things? Well, the reason is because the prevailing view at the time was the reason he was insane was due to witchcraft. So cut back to Louis, the king's brother, who is a drunken idiot who set everybody else on fire. Years earlier, he had been accused of sorcery because apparently he hired an apostate monk to enchant a ring, a dagger, and a sword with devilish magic so that the evil would corrupt the king. And, in fact, he was accused of sorcery so many times that he was later assassinated over it, and this sparked a decades-long civil war, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Because you see, we have a whole lot more weirdness to get to, and a whole lot more awfulness. So let's actually talk about the things that he did wrong. So to start off with, there's the anti-Semitism, because Charles VI expelled all the Jews from France. Now, the Jews being persecuted in the Middle Ages is nothing new. happens all the time. Mostly because anti-Semitism is all over the place in the Middle Ages, and it never really goes away. It's kind of like an undercurrent that just always is bubbling, and it bubbles up more sometimes than others. Now, the reason for him expelling the Jews, according to him, is that he's been hearing that the Jews have been doing bad things towards Christians, that they've been conducting evil acts towards the good Christians of his realm, and as a result, as a good Christian king, he has to protect his subjects and get rid of them. Why did he decide to do this? No one really knows. It could have been just a whim because he's out of his mind. It could have been that his queen told him to do it. I don't know if that's true or not, because the queen gets blamed for a lot of things in his life. Could have been his counselors who wanted to take advantage of things. Could have been a PR move. We really don't know why he just decides to do this one day. What we do know is that it wasn't well put together because it wasn't the sort of thing that they could do quickly or efficiently. What's also weird about it is by the standards of the time, it's fairly generous. So most of the time when something like this happens, you're essentially required to forfeit all of your property and you're basically required to leave under penalty of imprisonment or death. That's usually how this rolls out. That's not how Charles VI does it. Charles VI is like, you have a year to get out, sell all your property, and pay off all your debts. All the debts that Christians owe will be handled by the state. And once you've paid your debts and sold your property, the army will guide you to the border where you will be told to leave. In other words, the idea is that there's not going to be a pogrom. We are going to escort you through the border, and then you're on your own. You can take all your stuff with you, and we'll protect you as you leave, but you can't own property and you can't stay here. And again, that's bad, but it's also much more lenient than most medieval rulers who did this sort of thing did. That doesn't make it good, it just, in comparison, isn't as cruel. I know it sounds wrong, it's still bad, it's still anti-Semitic. This can be seen as either the beginning of the disaster that's going to hit France for the rest of his reign, or possibly the last moment where he's somewhat in control of things. Because after this point, France kind of begins snowballing towards utter ruin. Because he's still getting older, and so he's having longer and longer mental breaks, and it's clear that he's no longer able to rule the state. So instead of him, his wife convenes a regency council, which is made up of all the major, players in the realm, which again includes his uncles, who you might remember spent most of their time trying to ruin the state to begin with. This also includes Louis I, the king's brother, who again you might remember was accused of sorcery and also trying to murder his brother by setting him on fire. So yeah, that guy's involved. So one of the major issues with the king not being able to exert power over his nobles is that the nobles start fighting each other. So for example, his uncle, Philip the Bold, begins fighting his brother, Louis. Now, the thing is, though, is that Philip and Louis hate each other, but neither of them particularly want to go to war, because, again, it's during the 100 Years' War, the state is already, teetering on annihilation, everything's kind of going wrong, and so, despite the fact that they hate each other, they mostly keep their fighting to the court. They're not willing to risk a kind of escalation that will, make more problems for both of them. And this mostly works until Philip the Bold dies, and he's replaced by his son named John the Fearless. John the Fearless has basically no political skills. John the Fearless spends most of his time making an enemy out of everyone, okay? He is not somebody anybody really likes, and he doesn't really know or even really like court maneuverings, and so he finds himself outside looking in, which he chafes under because, again, he's a powerful lord just like his father was. He also still has the rivalry with Louis because they're continuing that problem because the rivalry is really built on political power rather than personal animosity. But John the Fearless is not one to let the risk of an escalation stop him from doing things that he wants to do. And so he responds the way every sane, logical, rational person would respond when you're frozen out of political power by a rival. he has Louis assassinated. Now, here's a question for you. Did he actually have Louis assassinated? And the answer is we don't know, but the thing is, at the time, he doesn't deny it. Everybody assumes it's him. Everybody is like, did you kill Louis? Did you pay somebody to murder him? And John the Fearless is like, well, I didn't not do it. I didn't do it, but I didn't not do it. And so he basically admits without admitting and doesn't deny the charges against him, which pretty much means he did it. In fact, when people begin asking him, hey, did you murder him? His response is a bunch of whataboutism and deflection, and he's like, well, I won't say I didn't do it, and I won't say that I did it, but, Louis was a demon-worshipping sorcerer, so the fact that he died means the tyrant is dead. So again, he totally did it. So Louis has a son named Charles, because there's lots of Charleses in this family, and he's like, you killed my father, prepare to die. To which John is like, you in what army? And so Charles is like, okay, be right back. So Charles goes to a guy named Bernard VII, who is Count of Armagnac. He is under the control of the French king, just as everyone else is. And Charles goes, hey, you want to help me attack the Burgundians, who are also under control of the French king? And Bernard VII is like, yeah, that sounds fun. So begins the decades-long Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War. Keep in mind, all of this is going on while Charles VI is king. All of this is going on under him. And again, all of this is going on during the 100 Years' War, during the 100-year hot war with the English. Now, amazingly, Charles seems to recognize that he's not going to be able to manage a civil war between two of his subjects and fight the English. And so he's like, okay, I need to make peace with the English so I can get the nobles in line so they'll stop fighting each other. So he marries his daughter Isabella to the King of England, Richard II. The thing is that Isabella is 7 and Richard II is 29. But there's a problem, because you see, Richard II is deposed. And the guy who comes to power is Henry V. And Henry V looks at France, which is in the grips of civil war, and goes, you know what, this would be a great time to invade and take more territory. For those of you who know your history and know who Henry V is, he's the guy who wins the Battle of Agincourt, which is one of the biggest French defeats in French history. It's really a terrible defeat. France loses decisively. It loses a bunch of its nobility. It is essentially broken as a military power, and fundamentally is powerless before the English. Henry forces Charles VI to sign the Treaty of Troyes, which essentially gives England a whole lot of territory, and also says that the child of Charles VI shall not be the next king. The next king will be Henry's child, Henry VI. So essentially, Charles signs away the French kingdom, and so now an English monarch will sit upon the French throne. Now, as you can probably imagine, this didn't all happen, and we're going to get into now why that happens as we're reaching the end of Charles's reign. It's also worth noted that John the Fearless of the Burgundians completely supported this, and in fact, the Burgundians essentially ally with the English against the French. And then John dies, and he's replaced by a guy named Philip the Good. Now, I'm not really sure why he's called Philip the Good, because he threw in his lot with an enemy nation, but that's his name, and I'm not the one who chooses these things. Now, as you can imagine, the French are not exactly willing to go along with the idea that an English king is going to sit on the French throne, and so they basically are all like, yeah, we're not going to do this. And so Charles's son, the one who has been disinherited, officially speaking, begins trying to rally support for a kind of French nationalism to expel the English and put a Frenchman back on the French throne. Only Philip the Good and the Burgundians are like, yeah, we're not going to let that happen, and so they invade Paris and put Charles VI on lockdown, essentially, ensuring that he can't escape. Not that he had anywhere to escape to, because he pretty much dies immediately after this event. So, what's the state of France at the end of Charles VI's reign? Well, the English have won the most decisive battle in the 100 Years' War. There's a civil war going on between two of the major houses in France. There's an English king on the French throne. The French guy, who is the son of Charles, has been deposed and basically has no power. Most of the French countryside has been ravaged. Large spots of France have been ceded to the English. Essentially, France is looking at ruin. And to top it all off, Henry V has just died, which means Henry VI, the baby, is now King of France, and in fact is baptized in Paris. So everything seems pretty bad. What happens next? Well, Joan of Arc shows up. Yeah, you know how in all the stories of Joan of Arc, when they're portrayed, how France is basically in ruins and everything is terrible? Yeah, that's the end of Charles VI's reign. Everything is so bad by the end of Charles VI's turn on the throne that Joan of Arc, a peasant woman, has to appear and save France because nobody else is capable of doing it, and he's left the place in such a horrid state. So, my theory is that he's not a terrible king because of the madness. The madness is just kind of like a cherry on top. The problem is that France under his reign is so poorly mismanaged and so barely put together that there's no real way to say that anyone was worse. Even if you were like, okay, like the 5-day-old baby wasn't there long enough and didn't really do enough, so he's basically neutral. And if you count Louis XVI, yeah, he was deposed, but France still existed. France, at the end of Charles VI's reign, might not exist if Joan of Arc doesn't exist. France is functionally incapable of managing itself, and it's only with Joan of Arc and the resurgence of a kind of French nationalism that France continues to survive. That is why, in my opinion, he's the worst king. Lots of terrible things happened during his reign, but the reality is that under no other king does the kingdom look like this after they're off the throne. In fact, France will come the closest it will ever be to ceasing to exist until the 20th century during World War II, when it's occupied and partitioned by the Nazis. And so in my mind, I can't say that anybody else is worse because nobody else leaves the kingdom like this. Even if they're bad kings, even if they're greedy, even if they mismanage things, nobody mismanages it to the point where everything falls apart. And on top of all of that, he's insane. That's not a moral failing on his part for being insane. There's nothing he can do about that. The problem is that it's hard to say that any other reign by any other French monarch went so disastrously in the entire history of French kings. And so that's why he's the worst king of France. I don't think there's an argument for anyone else.